I'm Chance Storland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as always, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Great to have you back here on the program, Elizabeth. We're starting off with something that has been in the headlines this past week. Tell me about it.
Yes, we had a situation in North San Antonio last week where federal officials shut down a human smuggling effort that involved 54 undocumented immigrants who were found inside the air-conditioned tractor-trailer that was parked in an alleyway kind of behind, kind of close to a neighborhood on the north side of San Antonio. Now, what happened, and this is something that is going to be covered by federal court, federal agents from Homeland Security and Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, they're still actually working to determine how this whole thing happened, but they arrested Gerardo Javier Carrion, who's 36 years old, from Laredo. And authorities are alleging that he was the person who drove the rig, and he has been formally charged with federal human smuggling violations. Now, this is actually a case that, it's horrible when you think about people who are locked up inside of a tractor-trailer rig. They have escaped from their country. People involved in this case are said to have been from Mexico, Guatemala, Brazil, and El Salvador. And we're not really getting a whole lot of information right now, which is kind of understandable from federal officials because they are still trying to figure out what they can find out about Carrion. What we've been able to find out about him is that he owns this truck and a trucking company of which he is the only driver. He does have a lengthy criminal record, but no one really knows how exactly this happened or how he came to be driving a rig that had all of these people in the back of it. Now, he is going to be appearing this morning in federal court, possibly for a bond hearing. And, he's going to start going through the court process in federal court. He faces 10 years in prison if convicted. But this was a situation when it happened, that's pretty remarkable. Last summer, there were several people who died. I believe 10 people died when they were found in a rig at a Walmart in San Antonio. And, special agent in charge, Shane Folden, told us at a news conference last week that, they're looking into this case, but it could have ended so much worse because, we could have seen people die. There were no fatalities in this particular case that happened last week. Only minor injuries were reported, but it was a chaotic scene that neighbors in the area described to reporters at the scene that included immigrants that were falling off of rooftops, just, in an attempt to escape. And there were police helicopters scouring the area when all of this occurred. One of the neighbors told my colleague, Jacob Beltran, that he found someone hiding behind one of his bougainvilleas in his yard, and that's like a big bush. So it was pretty chaotic of a situation that happened out there. So we will be likely hearing more about this. It's going through the federal court system. So my colleague and friend, Guillermo Contreras, is going to be covering this. He covers federal courts for the Express News. And we will be able to hear more as to how this whole thing happened, which, one of the things that was really hit home to us at the news conference with Agent Folden last week was that the best way to stop a human smuggling crime is to cut off the money. And he had said last year, Homeland Security investigations, which is part of the larger Homeland Security Department, which also includes ICE. He said that Homeland Security investigations seized about $524 million last year alone in what he called illicit currency and assets that he called incentives to do this crime. So, you know, he says human smuggling is a financially motivated crime, and you know these folks take advantage of people, and sometimes can kill them in the process. Like I said earlier, where you know at least 10 immigrants died last summer. You know, going through this process. You know, where you know we don't really know how far they have come, but what we do know is that according to Agent Folden, smugglers don't operate based on some sort of national pride or, he said, any type of commitment to individuals. He says that people who smuggle, you know, other people from places and bring them illegally into the United States, that their sole purpose is to make money. And they look upon these poor people who are trying to, you know, come to either join family members who are already here or to, you know, escape, you know, to get some sort of asylum. You know, Agent Folden says that basically smugglers will view these people as a commodity, like, you know, they would drugs or pencils. And it's all about how much money that they can get. And when he was talking about how this situation could have ended up a lot worse, is basically the fact that, you know, they could have been killed while getting here, or sometimes when people pay, you know, smugglers to get them to the United States, it doesn't really end here. Once they get here, they can be forced into some sort of slavery to do things to, you know, pay more money or even worse things. So, you know, it was a big situation last week. In speaking to some of the advocacy organizations, they were trying to get a hold of some of these folks to try to help them and see how they got here, or what their circumstances are, if they were, you know, fleeing, you know, a dangerous gang-infested area in their country, or if they were, you know, trying to seek some sort of political asylum. You know, Homeland Security investigations has told us that some of those 54 people may be held for material witnesses so that they can, you know, testify in Carrion's trial, or they may, you know, just be deported depending upon, you know, what their particular case is. So we're going to be hearing, you know, likely more about this later on. But all in all, the fact that, you know, it's a tragic situation that, you know, they had to get out of their countries and into our country in this particular way. But I think there's a lot of people who are breathing a sigh of relief that no one had any sort of injuries that were any more than minor.
And then, Elizabeth, as you mentioned, unfortunately, the San Antonio area has dealt with something like this in the recent past. Could you talk about how this case will either be similar or different from how it was handled, either that specific case in the past or any other past cases in Texas or just in the country when it comes to not only the smugglers, but then also the people who have made it to the United States and survived that process? Is it pretty standard how that's handled, or is it sometimes case to case?
Well, you know, it depends really on who you talk to. I'm not very familiar with federal law as it relates to immigration, but one of the things that I did learn in speaking with some refugee organizations and also with federal officials is that They will talk to people individually and try to ascertain just exactly what happened. The federal officials say they would talk to people and see who could be, like I said earlier, a material witness. But depending upon some of the people who were being smuggled into the United States, it all depends on whether they have been through this before, if they had some sort of deportation that occurred earlier because of a similar situation. They probably are likely, according to several people I talked to, they're probably likely to be deported as soon as possible because they already have a history. Now, if they don't, they'll be interviewed. And I was told that, each person would be handled on a case-by-case basis. So it's really kind of hard to tell. And, it's really been in the news this week also, the past couple of weeks, simply because, you're seeing that there are situations and new policies that are being followed where some of these people coming in with children are being separated, and the parents are going to one facility and the children are going to another. So I think really, as confusing as it seems when you watch the news about what's going on with immigration, I remain also to be confused, even as a reporter who's trying to find out information about this particular story. So probably the best I can say is to tune in to see how exactly this happened. Like I said, I think the federal officials are trying to figure out if Carrion was working just for himself or if he is working as part of a larger criminal organization that is taking money from people to smuggle them into the United States illegally.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. Moving now to our second case of today's podcast episode, Elizabeth, tell me about the first capital murder-death case since 2015. I believe on Friday of last week, they began jury selection for this.
Yes, they did, Chance. This is going to be the capital murder trial of Brian Flores. It's expected to begin after jurors are selected. And as you mentioned, this is going to be the first death penalty case that Bexar County jurors will decide since they sent Mark Anthony Gonzalez to death row in 2015 for the killing of Bexar County Sheriff Sergeant Kenneth Van. Now, this actually was the first capital murder death case that I covered as a courthouse reporter here for the San Antonio Express News. This was a brutal killing in 2011 of Sergeant Van. He was sitting at a stoplight in southeast Bexar County in the wee hours of the morning when Mark Gonzalez pulled up next to him and for some reason decided to get his AR-15 and shoot Sergeant Van. Experts testified at the trial that Gonzalez fired 46 shots, and of those, 26 hit Sergeant Van. And he was almost decapitated from the gunshots. He didn't see this coming. Crime scene photographs showed Sergeant Van had one hand on his laptop as if he was about to start typing. So that was a case that lasted, once it got to trial, it lasted almost about 2 months. And the reason that these cases last so long is how they choose, how they have to choose the jury. Now, let's get to Brian Flores' case. He was 33 years old and was already in jail when he was charged in December of 2015 with capital murder, multiple persons. He is accused of killing Joshua Rodriguez, who was 18, and Victoria Dennis, who was 17, in September of 2015. Now, Dennis was from Corpus Christi, and she had just moved to San Antonio, according to reports released at the time. So Brian Flores' alleged victims were both teenagers, and family members told police at the time that one of the victims, Joshua Rodriguez, had received death threats via Facebook because he had made a sex tape involving a female who has not been identified in any of the affidavits released. Now, this woman denied to authorities that there was a sex tape, but she did say that there was a photograph of she and the victim. And but she said her boyfriend did threaten Rodriguez. So she told police at that time, when this crime occurred, that her boyfriend would not have killed him, but that he might have asked Flores to do it. So this is a very interesting case because, like I said, there's not this particular crime happened in 2015, and what's interesting about it is that there were two other co-defendants who were also implicated in this case. And so far, a woman by the name of Samantha Cruz, it's unclear whether or not she's really going to be charged in this case. She was one person who was arrested along with Brian Flores. And then there was another person as well who was arrested. But the interesting thing that occurred is that he committed suicide in 2016 while in Bexar County Jail awaiting this case. This co-defendant in this case was Jesus Jose Lopez, 18, and he attempted suicide in his cell at Bexar County Jail. And by the time he was rushed to University Hospital, he had died. So at this point right now, all we have in this case going to trial first is going to be Brian Flores. And this case is going to be prosecuted by Jason Goss and Gretchen Slater. And the defense attorney is Edward Camara, and he likely is going to have another attorney sitting with him, as defendants in death penalty cases need to have two attorneys representing them. So let me tell you a little bit about how capital murder cases go. This particular case, as with others, we saw this with the Mark Gonzalez case. The county will call a pool of about 1,000 people just for this capital murder case because they are seeking the death penalty. And my courthouse sources tell me that this process it's very different because whenever you have just a regular felony trial, jury selection may see about 55 to 75 potential jurors for just your typical felony trial. But in the capital murder jury selection, it takes weeks and it involves this pool that I'm telling you about of 1,000 potential people. It could take up to 2 weeks to choose them, or it could take as long as 5 or 6. It just depends, because what happens is once they choose this particular panel, they will this potential panel, they will interview people in smaller numbers. I've heard that they'll take them each one at a time. They might do 5 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, or they could do, maybe 3. It just depends on how it goes. These potential jurors get questionnaires that can be up to 10 pages long at times. I hear from some of my courthouse folks. And they asked these jurors several questions to get basically to the one thing that they really need to know from them, and that's whether or not they can send somebody to death row. So this is going to be a process that is going to take a while. It could take maybe 2 weeks. It started on Friday. It could end at the end of next week. It could last a little longer, but it's going to take some time because each side needs to be able to find the people so that they can get to choose 12 jurors and maybe up to 4 alternates. And all of these folks will sit through trial until the very end. So if Brian Flores is convicted of capital murder, the jury will get to decide if he will get the death penalty, or if they decide not to give him the death penalty, he faces life in prison without the possibility of parole.
And of course, Elizabeth, as is often the case here on the docket, these 2 cases probably going to pop up, at least with an update here or two in the coming weeks here on the podcast. So as always, thank you so much for being on the show today. We'll talk to you in about a week. And stay tuned. Express News in print, expressnews.com, and also here the docket that's available in Apple Podcasts and anywhere that you download your podcasts for more updates from Elizabeth Zavala.
Thanks very much, Chance.
And a big thank you, as always, to San Antonio Express News court reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Storland.